The talk was advertised with different names: voting information, voter information. It's somewhat confusing, but voter information to me means the information about you that's officially on file that's used to conduct an election. Voting information is the information perhaps you use to form a preference and make a vote. So we're going to talk something that has theoretical as well as practical implications for our lives and participants in democratic choice. So just a little bit of background, because this always comes up. Our political culture is not a democracy, strictly speaking. It's a polity, a mixture of kingship, aristocracy, if you're lucky, and democratic participation. And a long time ago, Aristotle was part of a conversation in which he pointed out that there's no one best system. All the systems are unstable. But if you mix them together, you can have what we would now call redundancy. So that if one part fails, the other parts can restabilize the system. And he and Plato theorized about controlling the way information is processed in social choices to do this. And they never really reached a consensus, but Aristotle's idea of polity is something that most people don't know about. We're not taught to think about it for a lot of reasons. And the idea that you can have a competitive equilibrium among these various systems is actually quite a modern idea. So stability is actually achieved by creating a new sense of stability and equilibrium. So politics is actually a creative process of using information in different ways to create new solutions to problems. One other point about this: James Cole, a famous sociologist, pointed out that what we take for granted as modern democratic, quote-unquote, societies are outgrowths of institutional changes, not revolutions in human nature or psychology, but the fact that we have, for a long time, used money as an institution enabled us to adapt and create new market solutions to problems that didn't exist before. So what we're talking about in this presentation is essentially getting creative and using information in a different way with markets to try to deal with some very real problems. So this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to talk about what I see as the current situation, to inform you about things most people don't know about or worry about, and then what the system could look like with respect to what's going on in Pima County, what could it look like for me and you, and also what we could do to take back control of our information in a way that would change the system. So first we'll talk about the current situation and types of voter information. So this is an attempt to try to give an overview of what things look like when you look at voter information. At the very core is your vote, your choice. That's something that in our system is sort of like the birth control issue of politics. Like you can't touch that. You know, it's sacred. You can't share it. Certainly can't destroy it. But you can't use it either. Right? You're really restricted. And then the official voter registration information that makes it possible to conduct an election. And then the next loop around that is the peripheral information that may be associated with your personal vote and data that enables people to get more information about you if they need it for official or other purposes. And on top of that, then there's the rich information, enriched data, which may come from many sources, or in some cases you can buy it to try to give you a better picture of how to understand voters and market to them. And then finally, there's perhaps the most pure version of this data package, which is the voter targeting data, which can come from a number of sources, local and national. And it's not a Republican or Democratic thing, it's something that's done by both parties. So, this types of voter data might look something like this if you could see it. Most people don't look at what the government collects on them and how it's distributed, but certainly from county to county and state to state, it looks something like this. It has your name, address, contact information, when you registered, how you registered, perhaps some background on your ethnicity that's considered necessary in some places, and some places it's not collected. But where it's available, people certainly use it for marketing. And in the peripheral data then might include some other information, social media information, your participation record in previous elections, not how you voted, remember that's sacred, but that you voted, which is important in itself. And if there were a Freedom Data Enrichment Center online, it is almost something like this. If you go to various websites, you can package this stuff together, your core information, your voter information that gives other important information, and your enriched voter information, which is not hard to compile if you're good at data collection. And so you can gradually form a picture of people by what they do based on so-called public information. So one of the big issues as far as I'm concerned is voter consent. And voter consent involves tacit or explicit agreement to allow your data to be shared. And it works differently in different states. Some states have explicit statutes, others don't. They have sort of vague laws with a lot of loopholes to allow people to do almost whatever they want to do. And in some states, when I used to live in New Jersey, the main references are court opinions which were issued when people complained that their information is being taken and used. So in Pima County, it's customary for the parties to get free copies of the database that the registrar has, and all the parties get it. How they use it depends on their skill and their connectivity. But in Arizona, a typical example is that one county party that's closest to the Secretary of State's office gets the free copy. Why it's not distributed to all counties, I don't know. But they distribute it among themselves. In some cases, they charge each other money for it. And we're talking about maybe thousands of dollars, $30,000 for a copy of the database that you need to market yourself as a candidate or party where you live. And then these people actually distribute it across the country. They share it. They get money for it from polling firms, perhaps from national parties. There are national database infrastructures that take this data, and in fact they might pay you back in enriched data to give you extra information, and about that second part of the target that you can use, and that's worth money, certainly. The parties have their own histories, their own databases, and you can put that together and you can get an updated picture of what's going on. In other countries, for example, I'm familiar with Scotland. Scotland has laws that restrict the use of data. In fact, you can opt out of distribution for everything except the core data. Because in Scotland, the government uses the core data for commercial transactions. When somebody wants to validate you for a real estate transaction or some other credit transaction, they can check with the government, and they use that core data to say that you exist and that you live in at a certain address, and et cetera. It's very important. It's not clear to me that across the U.S. That governments share the data for the same reason, but it seems that in Scotland and other places I've looked at, they don't charge for it. So, you know, it may be public information, but it's also a public good that the taxpayers subsidize. And that's kind of interesting issue, because it solves the so-called free rider problem when people need to create and share information or create and share anything in society. An impediment usually is something that it's come to call the free rider problem. It means that, say, I want that good, great, I'll vote for it, but don't charge me for it. You pay for it, I'll share it, okay? And that happens a lot. But here in the way I look at it, the anti-competitive duopolistic party system essentially gets the data because they make the rules, and oops, can't quite see that, but we come to think of Europe having greater privacy laws, but a downside of that is that even though they do, and they're very well articulated rules, there's no connection between those macro level rules and elections. They don't apply to elections. So although, you know, perhaps we are somewhat ahead for thinking about some of these issues, in Europe they are not, and they're scared of what's happening. I mean, there are articles about the entrepreneurial style of elections that's already evident in British politics and some other systems that is starting to use this data-centric approach to elections, and they're not prepared for it. Even though they have these privacy rules in place, except for some places like Scotland that have adopted these rules, it's not clear that there's a system in place. So one of the issues I've already alluded to, this first point is, you know, why shouldn't the government charge for information? It's a service. I mean, you don't have to charge thousands of dollars, but when you look at a transaction-based thing, even a few pennies a transaction, there are a lot of transactions. You could raise some money. You could do things like, my goodness, pay for public elections, maybe. And you don't do other things that are technically feasible, that aren't done now. For example, like not only verify that your vote was received, something you could do in most places now, but actually verify that it was counted correctly. I mean, you wouldn't trust a bank to say, oh, thank you very much, Arnie, we got your money, right? Rest assured, sleep tight. You audit it in multiple ways. I get a paper copy if I want, I get electronic. I can actually go in the database myself. So I wouldn't trust a bank, not because they have malicious intent, although obviously some of them do, depending on the level you're talking about. But that it's just a way of protecting yourself against inadvertent error. And human systems and machine systems are not perfect. They'll never be. So actually checking up on things is a sensible policy. So here I mentioned again the public goods issues. Just to mention some libertarians I've spoken with have suggested that they want to live in a society where they don't pay taxes because they're not going to use any government infrastructure. They don't want it. But you can't escape it. I mean, the internet, in the early days of the Electronic Freedom Foundation, John Perry Barlow, I think his name was, he said, we just want to live out in our desert, we got our guns, don't mess with us, we don't want to pay taxes, representation, taxation with representation is tyranny, for goodness sake. So just leave us alone. So you know, some people would say if you're talking about different database files, there ought to be one just for libertarians. So they will have perhaps minimal taxation because they don't perhaps really want roads. but they're using the internet, and so there is some infrastructure that is government regulated or government supported or taxpayer supported that they share in, so perhaps they would grant, they would make a contribution to that, maybe they would pay taxes. Yes, Betty?
Let me ask you a question about your second bullet there.
Sure.
What would you propose
This?
as a means for somebody to access a database and retrieve the information from their ballot specifically, transmit it
Well,
over
that's a good question. What I'd like to postpone answering, because I'm going to deal with it a little later, because I think there are solutions to that. In fact, this at the bottom here, there are market approaches, if people use them, that might make it possible for somebody to trust a source, to represent them on their behalf, and go in and check that the data was actually computed reliably. So I'd like to answer that later if I can. Okay. But it's not a trivial question, but if you think about structuring institutions differently, so that many people, regardless of their political stripes, are against thinking about market solutions to problems, but in fact, from an information theoretic point of view, it can make a lot of sense. It makes a lot of things possible. So, there's some other key policy issues. One issue in Arizona has been selfies. There have been some decisions about that, although it's still an ongoing issue. Interstate presidential vote trading, which goes back to native trading in 2000. And cross intra-voting area trading, which is something I've come across, but it's a new idea. And then the question of buying and selling voting data. Should individuals be able to buy and sell their own data? So, this a picture I found on the internet, so that this woman would sell you her vote. I mean, in some states there were Darrell L. Castle and Scott N. Bradley were actually on the ballot, and if they wanted to raise money to get people to vote for them, and somebody voted for them and took a picture of their ballot at home, like this woman, so there's an X there by that choice, and you got a picture of that, would you pay for it? Because in fact, they could have switched. They could have taken a picture of the ballot and marked it and sent you the picture as validation that you're getting what you're paid for, but you probably shouldn't trust that. It's bait and switch. So, there are no federal statutory rules that govern voter information markets of any of the sorts we're talking about. There have been some federal court decisions regarding trading votes for votes. So the native trading we'll talk about in a minute is a good example of that. Where you're talking about trading votes for money, there are some cases, and the consensus seems to be that the reason that you and I cannot exchange our vote or voting information for money is that we're not competent to. And presumably the people who do it at the higher wholesale level market, in the legislatures and in campaigns, they're competent to. Maybe. Right? But in any case, that's not a resolved issue, but I've looked at some of those cases, and it's not strictly a legal issue. It's a question of what the logic of the argument in the decision was, and it comes down to the question of the competence of the voters. The natural question is, if you got these data or information brokers doing other things, why couldn't they act on our behalf and meet the court's requirement for a competent and reliable decision? I mean, I'm not certainly competent to manage my retirement portfolio. I mean, I know people who are economists and financial people who do not handle their own portfolios either. It's like doctors treating themselves. They hire professionals to represent them because they don't have the time, they don't have the extent of knowledge they'd like to have to do as good a job as they could. So they could hire a broker. I would do it. So these brokers could actually manage votes for vote trading, or perhaps vote for money. And you can have, if you think about the way voting information is undervalued, some really interesting market situations. So nadir trading, which I mentioned before, has been in the courts for a long time. And at the appeals court level, people said it was a legitimate expression of First Amendment freedom. When people were doing it, the objection in California originally was that the contract could not be validated. So, you know, it was a sensible objection, but then that objection was met. So in this most recent election, where I thought perhaps there would be some interest in similar strategic exchanges, there's no evidence that I know of that Jill Stein or Gary Johnson, who many people still haven't heard of, although Jill Stein was in the news more, had thought of this sort of thing. But it's an important strategic device that parties could use. Yes?
Could you just give the thumbnail?
I'm sorry, speak up.
Maybe you've already mentioned it, but could you give the thumbnail of what nadir trading is?
Nadir trading?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a good question. In 2000, nadir was running as a third-party candidate with Gore and Bush, and many people thought he was a spoiler. Nadir shouldn't have run, but he's Ralph Nader, for goodness sake, so, you know, he does what he wants. But what he did was he had a lot of strategic impact on the Electoral College outcome in certain states, particularly Florida, but in other states like California, big electoral vote states. So people who supported Gore got together to try to arrange for people who had this dilemma: should I vote for Ralph Nader, who's pure and great and everything, or should I vote for Nader and Gore? Is to make arrangements with people that wouldn't disturb the number of electoral votes that Gore would get. So if Gore lost Florida, he might gain electoral votes in other states. And it wasn't quite clear, particularly since the election was contested and drawn out, what the electoral vote outcome would be there. But people were trying to get, county by county, people to vote for Gore or make a deal elsewhere to help Nader. Nader wanted to get a certain percentage of the votes to get his federal matching funds. So the idea is, well, I'll make a deal with my friend in Nebraska, and you'll get a certain percentage of the popular vote going to Nader so he can qualify to get his matching funds. But it won't hurt Gore's chance of winning the electoral votes he needs to win the national election. Does that clarify?
Yeah.
And that sort of thing is a real problem. So, this is what your information portal might look at. You know, if you took control of the information that the county has about you, your core data, your historical data, your enriched data, your voter targeting data, even self-shared data that you might contribute to a database, or flash voter data that might come from your participation in flash events on the web or in social media, which can all be used to learn about you and people like you to manage an electoral campaign. So that's this data we're talking about with some voter control. That's real data. So on the other hand, you might have a situation in which I own my portal myself. I don't depend upon the government at all, unless it's inputting data, but it's my data. It's a smaller set of data. And I own all this data, and I determine how it's going to be distributed. Whether people are going to pay for it who get it, or whether people are invited to make a contribution to a charity of my choice, or maybe even a political party of my choice. So, and then there's perhaps the ultimate is I own everything and I have my own broker. I don't use the government broker. So FN Rodriguez, who does a very credible job given her constraints, is not going to have my data. So again, the data would look the same. It's distributed in a different way. So let's get to what you could do to take back your vote. So there's a lot of important voter information here that could be collected and used, would be valuable, so that you would collect my vote plus explanations of why I voted that way. I could sell that vote through brokers. It could be a separated process or it could be the same. I could add data to my peripheral information, and I could also perhaps have information associated with data that's not considered shareable at all, or new types of data. For example, I might volunteer to answer polling questions before, during, or after an election, which could be correlated with my official data, my voter registration database, that could be quite valuable and interesting. Or I could have user profiles that I can enrich. It could be a running profile. Or I could do things to make it impossible for anybody to target my information. So, for example, there are apps now available on the web to block people from capturing data on your phone, on your browser. So you can start to chip away at the database that people assemble about you and me that is used for marketing. And that would perhaps potentially change things. So if you reduce, if you think differently about data, you wouldn't just give it away. You might lease it, and the leases might have constraints. So yeah, you could collect my data, but it's only good for 30 days. And then it disappears. In fact, it disappears itself. Also, you could have futures markets. If this information becomes valuable, it becomes valuable enough so that a whole bunch of people are going to disappear or not appear at all for practical purposes during an election, so far as marketing data is concerned. So there'll be a demand for trying to get data for the next election instead of counting on getting it for free, because the parties make the decisions directly and indirectly about how to do this. They'll have to go out into the marketplace and get it themselves, even if they're no longer primary sanctioned by the government. If they're party conventions or party elections, I mean, some places, particularly in Canada, governments actually hire private companies to conduct their elections for them. Right? So if there are coalitions of vendors and companies that conduct elections, it could have a potential impact on the way voters participate in expressing their choices for things. So future voter information might involve a subset of the data that we now give away for free. So we can actually increase the price of that people pay for the information by reducing the supply of the information. And if the information were collected with a strategy in mind so that it is enriched, and I own it, so I'll give you my information, you enrich it, you use it, I want some report on that. I mean, right now there's no requirement for chain of custody. People get public information for free. There are some constraints on protecting people in the database who are in a witness protection program or stuff like that. But otherwise, there's no constraints. So if I trust people to take my information, use it responsibly, I want to know how they used it. I want to know who they gave it to, when, where. And if there's value that's added in that chain, I want a piece of the action, at least give me the information back. Then I can have my voter information broker share it on my behalf, for money or not for money. So, this is what a future paradigm might look like, and it might actually defuse what I like to think of as the supermarket model of campaign, in which people collect and use information about you as if you were going to the supermarket to get Cheerios or cornflakes. Politics is much more important about that than that. It's a whole history of voting theory that most people aren't aware of, even people in social science, that was concerned with designing systems to make the correct choice. And that has a lot of issues connected with it, certainly, and no one knows what a correct choice is. But certainly we could try to get there by going from this paradigm to a different paradigm to make things possible. So I'm skipping ahead, but I think we can move from a system which really involves voter information trafficking. You know, it's like sex trafficking, really. It's gross. But we sort of put up with it because that's the system that is, and we're conditioned to think about that. We could also have intrastate vote trading. So, for example, if there's if I live in Tucson and there's a close election for Pima County Supervisor and I have a favorite candidate, I could find somebody who would trade votes for me, like Nader and Gore. They'll vote for Pima County Supervisor because they don't really care about that too much. But I trade away my vote for Tucson City Council, which may not mean too much to me. So I think we have to start thinking of using markets for information as a way of overcoming free rider obstacles to system change. So that we gradually increase the limitations of voter data information, particularly for free. We can do things, small things, like demand requests for information, like an information request that normally get. What did you do with my data? Who got it? How much did they pay for it? Did they commit to use it in a responsible way? Is there any code of ethics or any sense of responsibility, standards that these people get when they take the data? And I think we need to take the study of how information is used away from the parties, because I mean this is common in people in Scotland talked about the same thing. The people who make the rules governing the collection and use of information are the people who do that for their own benefit. They're not thinking of us as citizens, and there's a conflict of interest there. So perhaps someday we can actually control our data, our information, before, during, and after the election. So that's it. And let me see if I can come back to Benny's question to the extent I can answer it. But my answer would be the way that problem would be solved would be through new market systems for controlling and sharing information. So those institutions have grown up for banking, and they're not perfect. People still break in and things like that. But there's a trusted relationship that's emerged because we now have systems in place that make it possible for us to do things in a different way. And what I'm suggesting is not that I have a solution to that problem, but that one would emerge if we had the freedom to explore new ways of doing things. Now, I'm sure you're probably not satisfied with that answer, but that's about the best I can do at this point.
Well, I'm very concerned about it. There's a lot of interest right now in allowing people to vote by using some sort of an internet portal. In this last election, we saw at least 2 states where their voter registration information was accessed without authorization. So I'm not convinced at the present time that we have adequate security on these systems to block unauthorized entry into the data. And the question I have is, you know, for some reason, societies have decided that the vote itself would be secret. And I suspect there's a lot of reasons for that. I know that in the wake of the 2016 election, there's a lot of animosities between former friends because of who they voted for.
Oh, sure.
One way or the other. And I'm very concerned that the publication of individual votes disclosed in a public format could get completely out of control.
Well, I wouldn't advocate that, but I think if I not own my information, I could determine if and how it's distributed. So you can, I mean, if you look at the way the information is collected about you for commercial transactions, I mean, it's trivial, everything you do. They have the last 4 digits of this, the last 4 digits of that. You don't have to divulge all your information to verify certain things. We've gotten used to doing that. We just don't do it for voting. I mean, it's not so much the information, it's how it's used. Those are social questions.
Well, but what I'm saying is there has to be a connection there someplace in the database between an individual's identification and the marks that were put on that paper. And once that connection exists in a database, it's vulnerable to...
But if I voted through an information broker the way I might vote, so to speak, through a bank when I make financial transactions, I trust that bank to act on my behalf with a reliable system that makes sure that my identity is not divulged in the sequence of transactions connected with what I'm doing.
Right, but the banks have a lot of money.
I'm sorry?
The banks have a lot of money to develop those systems, whereas our local county voter office probably doesn't have the same kind of money to get a nice secure system.
For sure.
that a bank
It's
has.
an undervalued resource.
But I think that another way of asking a very similar question is, where would the places that would be hosting these things get enough money to actually have the right security systems that you could trust them in the way that, as much as we trust our banks, we trust our banks?
Right.
There's massive.
Yeah, and it's hard to estimate that, but I think that I'm actually involved with some people to talk about these issues on an international basis because it has broad implications for not just so-called democratic societies, but societies where authoritarianism depends on making ritual use of elections for legitimacy. And it's a very different model, but it's related to the idea that you could raise the costs of gaining legitimacy by manipulating information. And if you think of it that way, there are a lot of things that become possible. Yes, Dan?
I have a question about the vote trading
Yeah.
issue. One of the things that sort of keeps coming up for certain topics like gun control and maybe climate change as well, that there are these issues where there's like a large percentage of people that care to some degree
Right.
about things going a certain way, and then there's this small group of people that care really strongly about things going another way. And so you have you have these cases where it seems like the majority will is not being is not getting its sway. And I'm wondering if allowing vote trading might just make that whole situation worse, because I don't care about, exactly who's on the city council very much, but there may be a few people out there with a lot of money that care a whole lot.
I mean, I'm glad you raised the question because vote trading is not a solution to our problems, and there have been a lot of studies showing that in economics that if you make a trade with me and I make a trade with somebody else, and these trades are myopic because each of us is reacting on a limited basis to what we know that seems to be, gee whiz, this would be a good deal. But then that person turns around and makes a deal with another person so that collectively the famous paper on this, everybody's worse off at the end of the story than they would have been if nobody had traded in the first place. That's a kind of extreme case. But, so I agree that that's a real problem. Majority is simply a way, the idea of a majority is not clear. If you go back, it was invented in many different cultures for the purposes of achieving a social consequence. So for example, in Middle Ages in Europe, majority was considered to be not just 51% of the votes, it was considered to be 51% of the votes of the people who were qualified to be counted. So in religious orders, for example, it may seem far afield, but those models have influenced us. It was assumed that God had created a culture in which there was a healthy or correct choice, and that the process of elections, for example, was aimed at trying to find out what that segment thought. And so, and this is really very influential, just without going too far afield, the Marquis de Condorcet in the 18th century, an atheist before the French Revolution, modeled voting processes on the basis of assuming that there was a correct choice, because he felt that there would be no other reason to accept the opinion of other people unless the collective result of that would be better than I could make myself. So why should I accept I wouldn't accept everybody's choice what cereal to buy. Right? I would choose myself on the basis of my own knowledge and preferences and information. So, I mean, it may sound crazy, but he was saying that as rationalists, there's no reason to accept the group choice about anything, and that there's some benefit to me. So if they have some insight into what a correct policy or consequence would be, then I should pay attention to it. Otherwise, I shouldn't accept the legitimacy of that institution at all. So, yes, Ben?
Well, we have vestiges of that in this country when we first started, that property owners voted for the
Right.
elected officials.
Absolutely.
Because they were wealthy and they knew stuff.
Well, and there was a long and hard debate in the Constitutional Convention about how to allocate voting power. There was serious debate about allocating power according to the percentage of the money of the federal budget that a state contributed. And that would fluctuate, right, from election to election. And you know, it's an interesting idea because it's related to this notion of reliability or competence we were just talking about. It was assumed, going back to English traditions, that only people who had property should vote because property was a measure of intelligence or competence. So like, you know, who do you want to fix the problems of the country? Elect one of the richest men, for goodness sake. Trust me. I know debt. I know business, right? So that's similar idea. And if you look at the arguments, there's some. You know, I think if we had a constitutional convention today, those arguments would come up again because it would be interesting. And if you look at the way public stock or private stock corporations work, the voting power is distributed according to the shares you own, to your contribution to the corporation. So if we rethought the notion of what the basis of voting might be, it could follow that argument. Just one other thing about re-engineering elections, to go back to this vote trading. You can make vote trading unnecessary because one of the things we can do is take a look at the way we use time in elections. We're hostages to our customs. We have elections at a time of year according to an agrarian business cycle, when the farmers can come to vote. And we have completely different culture. We shouldn't rush to make choices. We can have them made over time. We should be able to change our votes. For goodness sake, you can buy a car and drive it home and bring it back next week and say, I don't like it. Right? But a choice as important as a president or a city council member influencing your lives. You make a decision you can't change. And it's, you know, it's a manipulative game.
So you're proposing a return policy on the presidents? Do we?
I'm sorry?
How long is the tryout period for the president? Do we get like
Buyer's remorse.
a couple weeks, or do we get a couple months?
Well, good question. Well, to start with, I would say we should have the elections last at least a couple of weeks. And then in that period, even people who are tricky and evasive and entertainers, you know, would probably be forced to divulge information about themselves, because people, for goodness sake, are thinking about their ballots and they're marking their ballots and say, well, he didn't tell us about his tax returns, did he? Are there any conflicts of interest? What did you really do with Russia? And you know, I'm sitting home, I'm making a decision about you, Donald. You better tell me the facts. It changes the game.
Don't we do that with an 18-month campaign and a 30-day?
We have that already. We just don't have it with the information we need to make the kind of decisions that would counterbalance things a little
I was
bit.
hoping you were going to advocate shrinking the campaign to 90 days.
Well, I would like.
5 days.
Well, in Europe they do that, but they're getting to be more like us because they're becoming more entrepreneurial. I would really like to urge people to consider kingship again. You know, it's a much maligned system.
You might not have a choice.
Marty,
Yes.
I have a quick question, and we've talked about this quite a bit. And I know LA County is spending a lot of money to solve this problem. And maybe the internet isn't ready to solve this problem. I don't know if I'm ready to take it out of the hands of government and hand it to a company, but that would be a way to have, like the bank analogy, because then the company would promise security and it would be a for-profit thing. I don't know if I'm ready for that,
I
but
agree, I don't know which one is more.
Well,
I'm scaring myself, because I'm actually thinking it would be more reliable now than government. But how did Scotland get, at least if we could start with a baby step, how did Scotland get that accomplished?
You know,
So that I have the right to opt out of the database collection?
That's a good question. As part of this project, which I hope is going to be funded soon, I'm supposed to be going there and actually going around the world to talk about information, just what people know and do. Just one other point about the question you raised. There's Robert Nozick, a famous political philosopher and sort of Bible writer for a lot of libertarians, talked about the idea of having protective agents that would develop in market-oriented political institutions that would do just what you're talking about. So that the state would, you know, but you know, Steve Bannon is not a serious thinker, even though he poses himself as being thoughtful. But many libertarians have thought about the idea of getting rid of the state. The state is really an artificial mistake that we had made, because going back to Thomas Hobbes, the argument was that, for goodness sake, if we don't have the state, what will happen to us? You know, you're going to give up your freedom and everything. Yeah, but what will happen to us? We're scared. So we need the state, and we give them monopolistic control over many parts of our lives. In return, we get security. Thomas Hobbes' famous argument. So if you have protective agencies, Nozick theorized, you could change the way we do business about our lives, so that I would no longer I would vote with my feet, right? Because I would choose the company that would protect my community. For goodness sake, we have gated communities already. Right? We just have to get the other. So, you know, and it may sound outrageous for somebody who studied voting and elections to say that perhaps elections are not the way to go. But, you know, maybe there's some reason for that. Yes?
So I have a question about, on one of your slides, it was 20, we're talking about...
I'm sorry, could you speak?
Sorry, on one of your slides, I think it was 28, we're talking about
Yeah.
controlling the data that's released, if you control your
Right.
voter data to a portal,
Right.
and that. So I was wondering, were you envisioning a
kind of regulatory system with enforcement for making sure that third parties don't disseminate beyond the bounds that you set as the provider of the information? Or did you have some technical solution that didn't rely on such regulation? And if so, what's...
Well, it could be a combination of those things. So I would put more emphasis on what institutions could do rather than agreements. But certainly, it could be, if you had a responsible industry devoted to this sort of functionality, I mean, businesses do things to protect their customers because they get money from them, right? So it's not outlandish to think that people could protect their customers, really, not just manipulate them, but actually protect their interests in the way that financiers, some of them do, some banks do. So I'm open to ideas. It's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to it, but it could be some combination of those things.
Because I'm just thinking there's some possibility for a black market to develop, maybe, people...
Yeah, but there are black markets now, right? I mean, there are no perfect systems like that. So I think it's a question of balance. Going back to Aristotle's idea of balance in nature. Other questions?
One just follow up?
Sure.
It's not really that related, but so do you worry in the case where someone wants to provide information about their own vote and explanation?
Right.
I was worrying about some disproportionate impact on the poor who might be enticed to vote against their interests because they need the money. So someone who's poor, the benefit of being paid for your information is so much greater than someone who's rich and can disregard that payment, that you might have an even more direct influence of money on elections, and it might lead to some really bad...
Well, it's a good question, but I think it could go the other way, because it depends on what information. For example, if I divulge my information, I also divulge the reasons that I made my choices, and beyond that, I'm willing to answer some questions you might have beyond that about what I'm thinking about in the next election, right? That there could be countervailing forces, so that certainly a lot of people might tell their vote, and it's one of the big questions that came up in those court cases, like, you got homeless people and they're eligible to vote, and I give them money and they vote. Is that a good thing to do in a democratic culture? Well, I think that we might have to learn to deal with those problems, and over time we might find that there might be efforts to educate those people to make more informed choices. If they can change their votes like everybody else, gee whiz, they may not be the dregs of the earth that most people think they are. I mean, we've had that experience in Tucson I lived downtown, and people who thought those people should be just brushed under some rug someplace, when they started to interact with them, found that many of them, particularly many of the veterans, were actually not stupid. They had legal and other arguments to try to defend their perspective on things. So I think if we start to think about the way things might work, that it might change. Even in classical Greece, the argument against democracy was very similar. If you let those people participate, are you crazy? They're not educated. They didn't study with Plato. But Aristotle thought you could have improvement. It's the basis of the later theories that came into vogue of the perfectibility of man. That we could, through education, change things. Because you're not going to change human nature, but you can educate people. You can develop better systems. And you can perfect the way things work that way. Does that respond to your question?
Yeah.
I disagree because of Maslow. So,
I'm sorry?
because of Maslow's hierarchy, I disagree. That if a person is poor, they have to manage their most basic needs first. So they can't worry about the long-term or higher function sort of things. They have to worry about food on the table next week, or medicine for their kids, or whatever. So they're going to take the money, do the vote, get medicine for their kids. And that might lead to some bad consequence down the road, but their kid got medicine, you know? So you deal with the basic stuff first. So they can't make an intelligent, I mean, there is no such thing. They're making an intelligent choice, which is get medicine for my kid.
Let me say that I disagree with Maslow's hierarchy. And I mean, if you look at, for example, revolutionaries who go out and fight against the government, they're not rational in that sense. They're not taking care of those basic needs because they perceive and value the higher goals that they presumably aren't ready for without changing the whole structure of the system. And they're willing to risk their lives and fight because they believe that that is just, and they're motivated by that, and they motivate other people. So I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm saying, and there are a lot of counterexamples to Maslow's theory, and I do think, look at the really imaginative ideas that people have had who are very wealthy. Bill Gates, Facebook, creating infrastructure to share information, to educate people around the world.
I'm not against the education
operation.
part.
I'm sorry?
I'm not against the education part.
I'm just saying you can't wait. I'm saying that the driving force of new institutions can do surprising things. But I mean, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, well, you could push the scale, so I'm not,
Yeah.
People may make a different decision.
Right.
It's just at the extremes where they're, too close to the edge, or the kid happens to be sick today. That's the problem. So we're officially out of time, I think.
Yeah, well, I thank everybody for coming,
Thank you.
and I thank you for the spirited discussion.
Thank you.